I never thought I'd end up here, living in my aunt's house, trying to put my life back together. But life has a way of throwing curveballs you don't see coming. The words echoed in my mind as I stood on the front porch, my bags at my feet. Aunt Grace opened the door, her smile warm but laced with concern. She was in her early 40s, but she carried herself with a confidence that made her seem younger. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and her green eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and worry. "It's good to see you," she said, pulling me into a quick hug. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted." "Thanks, Grace," I said, stepping inside. The house smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon, a comforting contrast to the chaos I'd left behind. My parents' divorce had been messy, and with my college funds tied up in legal battles, moving in with Grace had seemed like the only option. She'd insisted I stay as long as I needed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was imposing. Grace had always been the cool aunt. She wasn't just family. She was the person who bought me my first guitar, let me stay up late watching horror movies, and always seemed to understand when no one else did. "It's been too long," she said as she led me to the guest room. "You've grown so much since the last time I saw you. You're practically a man now." I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, it's been a while." She helped me settle in, chatting about her work as an interior designer and her plans for the house. "I've been wanting to redo the kitchen," she said, her voice animated. "Maybe you can help me with some of the heavy lifting while you're here." "Sure," I said, grateful for the distraction. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and adjusting. Grace made me feel at home, cooking my favorite meals and giving me space to breathe. But there was something about her presence that I couldn't quite put into words, a warmth that felt different now that I was older. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, I caught myself stealing glances at her. She was wearing a simple tank top and shorts, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. It wasn't inappropriate, it was just Grace being herself. But for some reason, I couldn't look away. "Everything okay?" she asked, catching me off guard. "Yeah," I said quickly, looking back at the TV. "Just tired." She smiled, her eyes soft. "You've been through a lot. It's okay to take some time to adjust." I nodded, but the unease in my chest didn't go away. A week later, we found ourselves sitting on the back porch late at night. The sky was clear, the stars brighter than I'd seen in years. Grace handed me a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, her voice quiet, "when your mom and I were your age, we went through something similar. The divorce, I mean. It's not easy to see your family fall apart." I looked at her, surprised. "You never told me that." She shrugged. "It's not something I like to talk about, but I thought it might help to know you're not alone." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Thanks, Grace. That means a lot." She reached out, her hand brushing mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt more intimate than it should have. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, the silence heavy with something unspoken. Then she pulled her hand back, breaking the spell. "It's late," she said, standing up. "We should get some sleep." "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. "Good night, Grace." After that night, something changed. Grace and I were still close, but there was a tension between us that hadn't been there before. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as we worked on clearing out the garage, I accidentally knocked over a box of old photos. Grace laughed as she helped me pick them up, her laughter ringing out like music. "You were such a cute kid," she said, holding up a picture of me in a superhero costume. I rolled my eyes, my cheeks flushing. Yeah, laugh it up." She grinned, her eyes sparkling. "I mean it. You've grown up a lot, but you still have that same spark." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her expression softening. "I'm proud of you, you know, for how you've handled everything." "Thanks, Grace," I said again, my chest tightening. That evening, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she'd laughed, the way her eyes had lingered on mine, the way her touch had felt both comforting and electric. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I first realized just how much Grace had become a part of my daily routine. Her presence was comforting, grounding even, but it was also complicated. She had a way of making me feel seen, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And yet, there was something about the way she looked at me sometimes, a softness in her gaze that felt too intimate. I tried to shake the thoughts from my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Grace was just being Grace, kind, supportive, and maybe a little too good at making me forget about the mess I'd left behind. It was raining that day, the steady patter against the windows creating a cozy atmosphere in the house. Grace was in the living room, her legs tucked beneath her as she read a book. I sat across from her, flipping through channels aimlessly, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. "You look bored," she said, glancing up with a teasing smile. "Just a little," I admitted. She closed her book, setting it aside. "How about a game? Something to pass the time?" "Sure," I said, grateful for the distraction. She grabbed a deck of cards, her laughter filling the room as we played a game I hadn't touched since I was a kid. For a while, it felt normal, like nothing had changed. But then her hand brushed against mine as she reached for the deck, and the spark that followed was impossible to ignore. I froze, my heart pounding as our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then she pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing. "Sorry," she said quickly, looking away. "It's fine," I said, my voice shaky. "Really?" But it wasn't fine. Not even close. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving the house eerily quiet. I tossed and turned for hours before finally giving up and heading downstairs. To my surprise, Grace was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine. She looked up when she saw me, her expression softening. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, taking a seat across from her. "Guess I have too much on my mind." She nodded, swirling her wine glass thoughtfully. "It's hard, isn't it? Letting go of the past." "Yeah," I said, my chest tightening. "It feels like no matter how hard I try, it's always there." She reached out then, her hand covering mine. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "I'm here for you. Always." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the sincerity in her voice making it impossible to look away. For a moment, I thought about pulling my hand back, about breaking the connection between us. But I didn't. Instead, I let her touch linger, the warmth of her skin sending a shiver down my spine. "Thanks, Grace," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, but there was something else in her eyes now, something that made my pulse race. The next day, Grace suggested we tackle the yard. The rain had left the grass overgrown and the flower beds in need of attention, and I was more than happy to focus on something other than my own thoughts. We worked side by side for hours, laughing and joking as we pulled weeds and trimmed hedges. But every so often, I caught her looking at me, her gaze lingering just a second too long. At one point, as I was struggling to move a heavy planter, she came up behind me, her hands steadying the base as I lifted. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. "You've gotten strong," she said with a smile, her tone light. "Thanks," I said, my voice shaky. Her eyes met mine then, and for a moment it felt like the world had stopped. The tension between us was undeniable, and I could feel my resolve slipping. But then she stepped back, breaking the moment. "We should take a break," she said quickly, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah," I said, grateful for the reprieve. That evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, the tension between us reached a breaking point. I could feel her presence beside me, the warmth of her body a constant distraction. When the credits rolled, she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "You've been quiet tonight," she said. "Just thinking," I replied, my throat tight. "About what?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "About us," I admitted finally. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "What about us?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I feel like something's changed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Between us?" She didn't respond right away, her gaze searching mine. "It has," she said quietly. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over us like a heavy fog. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. "This is complicated," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't—" "I know," I said quickly, cutting her off. "But I don't want to stop." Her eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "Neither do I," she admitted. The space between us disappeared then, and for the first time, we stopped pretending. The kiss was electric, more powerful than anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if all the tension, all the unspoken words between us, had been waiting for this exact moment to explode. For a brief, blissful instant, the world melted away. But then reality came crashing back. Grace pulled away, her cheeks flushed, her breathing uneven. "This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't do this." "I know," I said, my own voice shaky. "But—" "No," she interrupted, standing abruptly. "We need to stop. Right now." I nodded, though my chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. "You're right. I'm sorry." She didn't respond, her gaze darting toward the stairs. "I'm going to bed," she said quickly. "Good night." "Good night," I whispered as she disappeared from the room, leaving me alone with the weight of what we'd just done. The next morning, the house was filled with an almost unbearable tension. Grace avoided my eyes as she moved around the kitchen, her usual warmth replaced by a careful distance. "Good morning," I said, my voice hesitant. "Morning," she replied, not looking up from the coffee pot. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "About last night." "Let's not talk about it," she said quickly, cutting me off. "It was a mistake." We were both emotional. "Right," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "A mistake." But the way she avoided my gaze told me she didn't quite believe it, and neither did I. For the next few days, we both tried to pretend like nothing had happened. Grace kept herself busy with work, and I spent most of my time holed up in my room, trying to sort through the whirlwind of emotions in my chest. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. Every time I saw her, every time our hands brushed or our eyes met, it felt like a magnet drawing us together. It all came to a head one evening when we were alone in the kitchen. My dad had called earlier to say he'd be working late, leaving us to fend for ourselves for dinner. As I helped Grace chop vegetables, our hands brushed, and the spark that followed was impossible to ignore. She froze, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "We can't keep doing this," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," I said, my heart pounding, "but I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath hitched, and she looked away. "This isn't fair to you, or to me, or to your dad." "I don't care," I said, stepping closer. "I care about you." "Stop," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. But when I reached out, my hand brushing her cheek, she didn't pull away. That night, the lines between us blurred completely. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't logical, but it felt inevitable, like a storm that had been building for weeks finally breaking free. Afterward, as we lay in the dim light of the living room, the weight of what we'd done pressed down on us like a heavy blanket. Grace sat up, her expression torn between regret and something else I couldn't quite name. "This can't happen again," she said firmly, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. But deep down, we both knew the truth. It wouldn't stop. Not now. In the days that followed, the tension between us only grew stronger. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment felt charged with the weight of our secret. And it wasn't long before someone else started to notice. It started with small comments. Grace's neighbor stopping by to drop off mail and glancing between us a little too curiously. Or my dad mentioning how quiet Grace had been lately, his tone laced with suspicion. "You okay?" he asked one evening as we sat in the living room. "Of course," Grace replied, her smile too bright. "Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't push it, but the way he looked at her made my stomach twist. The breaking point came one evening when my dad came home early. Grace and I were in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones, when we heard the front door open. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers, my heart racing as my dad walked in. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "Just making dinner," Grace said quickly, her voice a little too high. "Uh-huh," he said, his eyes flicking between us. I forced a smile, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Want some help?" I offered, desperate to change the subject. He didn't respond right away, his gaze lingering on Grace for a moment longer before he nodded. "Sure." As I turned back to the counter, I caught Grace's eye, and the fear in her expression was unmistakable. The next morning, the tension in the house was suffocating. My dad had left for work early, but the shadow of his suspicions lingered like a dark cloud. Grace moved around the kitchen with a forced air of normalcy, her hands shaking slightly as she poured her coffee. "We need to be more careful," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But he doesn't know anything yet." "Yet," she repeated, her tone sharp. "He's not stupid. If we slip up, even once—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The consequences were obvious, and they terrified both of us. Over the next few days, Grace and I tried to put distance between us, but it only made things worse. The more we avoided each other, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. One evening, my dad cornered me in the living room, his expression serious. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Just a lot on my mind," I said, forcing a shrug. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No," I said quickly. "It's nothing." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. "For now." It happened on a Saturday night. My dad had gone out with friends, leaving Grace and me alone in the house. We promised ourselves it wouldn't happen again, but the silence between us was unbearable. I found her in the living room, staring out the window with a glass of wine in hand. She didn't look up as I entered, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Grace," I said softly, stepping closer. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "This has to stop," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," I said, my chest tightening, "but I don't know how." Before she could respond, I closed the distance between us, my hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a moment before she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. The kiss was desperate, filled with all the emotions we'd been trying to suppress. For a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. But then the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment, and we sprang apart like guilty children. "Hello," my dad's voice called out from the hallway. Grace's eyes widened, and she stepped back quickly, smoothing her hair. "In here," she called, her voice strained. My dad entered the room, his gaze flicking between us. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "We were just watching a movie." He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Grace for a moment before he turned back to me. "Don't stay up too late," he said before heading upstairs. The silence that followed was deafening, and Grace wouldn't meet my eyes. The next morning, Grace received an unexpected visit from her neighbor, Mrs. Klein. I overheard their conversation from the hallway, my chest tightening as I caught snippets of their exchange. "I'm not one to pry," Mrs. Klein was saying, her voice low. "But you should be careful. People talk, and well, it's easy for things to be misunderstood." "Thank you for your concern," Grace replied, her tone tight. "But there's nothing to worry about." Mrs. Klein didn't sound convinced. "Just be careful, Grace. That's all I'm saying." When the door closed, I stepped into the living room, my heart racing. "What was that about?" Grace shook her head, her expression strained. "Nothing. Just nosy neighbors." But the fear in her eyes told a different story. That evening, my dad confronted Grace. I could hear their voices from my room, muffled but intense. "You've been distant lately," he was saying. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Grace replied quickly. "I've just been stressed." "Is it about him?" my dad asked, his tone sharp. There was a long pause before Grace responded. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about," he said, his voice rising. "The way you've been acting, the way he's been acting." Do you think I haven't noticed? I couldn't hear her response, but the sound of my dad's voice growing louder made my stomach twist. The next day, the three of us sat around the dining table, the silence between us thick with tension. My dad's eyes flicked between Grace and me, his expression unreadable. You know, he said suddenly, his tone casual but pointed. It's funny how people think they can keep secrets. But the truth always comes out. My chest tightened, and I avoided his gaze, focusing on my plate. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she picked at her food. Don't you think so? My dad asked, his gaze piercing. Of course, Grace said quickly, her voice strained. The rest of the meal passed in unbearable silence, and by the time I escaped to my room, I felt like I could barely breathe. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. Grace and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own corners of guilt and fear. My dad, meanwhile, seemed more watchful than usual, his eyes tracking every movement, every glance, every subtle interaction. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. It happened on a Friday evening. My dad had gone out to meet some friends, leaving Grace and me alone in the house. We tried to keep our distance, avoiding even the slightest chance of being alone together. But later that night, as I passed the living room, I saw her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked lost, her shoulders slumped, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Without thinking, I stepped into the room. Are you okay? I asked softly. She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know how much longer I can do this, she admitted, her voice trembling. I sat down beside her, careful to keep some space between us. We'll figure it out, I said, though I had no idea how. She shook her head. It's not just about us anymore. Your dad, he knows something's wrong. And if he finds out the truth. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand resting lightly on her shoulder. That was the moment the front door opened. My dad stood in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and anger as he took in the scene. What the hell is going on? He demanded, his voice sharp. Grace sprang to her feet, her cheeks flushing. Nothing, she said quickly. We were just... Don't lie to me. My dad snapped, his gaze shifting to me. You think I haven't noticed the way you two act around each other? The looks, the whispers. Do you think I'm blind? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Is it true? He demanded, his voice rising. Have you been sneaking around behind my back? Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. It's not what you think, she said weakly. Then what is it? My dad roared, his fists clenched at his sides. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like you've betrayed me. The room fell silent, the weight of his accusation hanging heavy in the air. Grace finally spoke, her voice trembling. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her eyes pleading. It just did. My dad stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. How long? He asked, his voice cold. How long has this been going on? Dad, please, I began, but he cut me off. Don't, he said sharply, his gaze snapping to me. Don't you dare try to defend this. He turned back to Grace, his voice breaking. I trusted you. I loved you. And this is how you repay me? Tears streamed down Grace's face as she tried to explain. I never meant to hurt you, she said. But things between us, between you and me, they haven't been the same for a long time. And that makes this okay, my dad shouted, his voice echoing through the house. No, Grace said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. But it happened, and I can't change that. The days that followed were a blur. Grace packed her things and left, her face pale and tear-streaked as she loaded her car. My dad didn't say a word to her, his silence colder than any argument could have been. He barely spoke to me, either. When he did, his words were clipped and laced with disappointment. I don't know who you are anymore, he said one evening, his voice heavy with pain. I wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow make things right. But the truth was I didn't know how. Grace's absence left a gaping hole in the house, but my dad and I pretended like nothing had changed. We avoided each other as much as possible. Our once close relationship, now little more than a strained coexistence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Grace had moved to another town, starting over in a place where no one knew her name or her mistakes. I didn't blame her. As for me, I tried to move on, but the weight of what I'd done stayed with me. It was a lesson I'd carry for the rest of my life, about trust, betrayal, and the consequences of crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. Sometimes I wonder if things could have turned out differently, if we'd stopped before it was too late, if we'd made different choices. But life doesn't work that way. All you can do is pick up the pieces and hope that someday, somehow, you'll find a way to put them back together.